Hi students, welcome back to another week. I hope you're doing well. We have a lot to cover this week, but first I want to go over just some general housekeeping things before we jump into the lecture. So just so you know, you do have your discussion board this Wednesday, and then you have your introduction, your body paragraph, and conclusion due on 3/7, so on March 7th at 11:59 p.m. I'm hoping that I have that feedback back to you by the 12th so that you can have about 5 days to apply that feedback to be able to turn in your final essay. My hope is that by giving you some feedback on your introduction, one body paragraph, and conclusion, that it'll really prepare you to know what you need to work on for the remainder of your essay. This week, you also have spring break coming up, which is wonderful. The only thing you're responsible for is working on your short research essay. Please keep in mind the final short research essay is due on the 17th of March. So you need to adequately prepare to turn that in on the Wednesday that we return from spring break. We will also begin our readings over an Enemy of the People. So if you have no plans and you want to get ahead on your schoolwork, you're welcome to start jumping into that reading. That's why I went ahead and opened up week 5 and week 6 together and early. So for those of you that really want to get a jump start on your rough draft and you want to turn it in early so that I can give you early feedback, some of you may have your entire essay completed before you ever go on spring break. So I wanted to make that available to you. So without further ado, we are going to be going over citations today. That is going to be our big topic for this week. So we talked about last week about outlining and building paragraphs, but we didn't really get into how do you apply the research that you're doing into sentence structures? How do you place that in a paragraph? So I'm going to share my screen with you. So today we're going to be talking about the basics of MLA citations. Why do we choose to cite research? This is really the first question that we should be asking before we really get into why we do this. When we are talking about a specific topic, using research indicates that we've taken the time to really learn about that topic in order to prove that point or argument. It shows that you understand that the work that you're using is someone else's work. It's not something you've created. It's not research that you've drafted. It's someone else's doing that you are using to support your thinking. If you're ever questioning whether you should cite a work, you should remember that it's better to play by the rule. It's better to be safe than sorry. If you're questioning whether you should cite it, there's a good chance you probably should. And finally, when you cite your sources, you're giving the reader a direct guide as to where to go in order to find that particular information. It gives the reader the opportunity to do more of their own homework on the subject. So essentially, whatever you're writing about, whether you're writing about perfect qualities for an ideal teacher or an ideal doctor or an ideal engineer, you are giving someone access to the works that you've used so that they can go on and read the entire thing if they want to. So the first thing that we need to discuss is that you must consider the context and the connections of your research. When you're building a paragraph, you must consider the context of your research. Here are a few questions that you may want to ask yourself as you're beginning to write your body paragraphs out in your sentence structures. What do I need my reader to understand about this particular research? How is this helpful to the point that I'm trying to convey? What information do I need to include to ensure they can locate the work in my works cited page? And what lead into the quote, paraphrase, etc., makes the most sense for this particular sentence? And then you also need to plan the connection of your citations. There are always going to be two parts that you have to consider. what goes in your in-text citation. And what I mean by in-text citation is when you're building that paragraph and you're using sentences within that paragraph, you have what we call a parenthetical expression. And I'm going to show you an example of that later on in the lecture. What information do you need to include in that? And then how does that information mirror what's in your works cited page at the very end of your essay? So let's take a look at why those connections matter. In the text of her research essay, Julius Sikowitz paraphrases material from a journal article by anthropologist Arlene Davila. As shown, she cites the article page on which the original information appears in a parenthetical reference that points readers to the entry for Davila Arlene in her list of works cited. She also cites portions of a personal interview that she has conducted with Seth Camille, which has no page numbers. These examples show just two of the many ways to cite sources using in-text citations and a list of works cited. You'll need to make case-by-case decisions based on the types of sources you use. So what I'm trying to convey here is if you are using a YouTube versus a peer-reviewed scholarly text, those are going to require different pieces of information. So if you look in this picture right here, what I want to point out to you is right here, the writer is introducing something that Davila claims. She says, commodifying minority culture is problematic, Davila claims, because in the eyes of tourists, policymakers, and even scholars, not all culture is created equal. For example, Harlem is internationally famous as Black Mecca, yet it is also more than half Latino and a center for the Nuyorican identity, urban Latinidad, and Latino dance and music. And then we see the page number. So what this author did is they gave credit to Davila. They mentioned her name in the source, and then they included the page number at the end of their parenthetical citation. So when we go to the works cited, we see that Davila's last name is there, and we can see the page numbers that they indicated as well. This is a very typical way to create an in-text citation in your essay. Then as we go to the bottom here, we see another example. He notes that the biggest problem with Harlem tours are perceptions that customers have, and he tries to avoid disrespecting the community, refusing to take part in gospel tours, which he sees as violating Harlem's places of worship. He also cares about what the Harlem residents think of his tours. In his opinion, Big Onion Walking Tours has a unique relationship with the community, and we see that there's a quote, so he's taking something directly from the source. And he notes that many Black residents will stop to listen to his white guides to check that they're being respectful and accurate. And then we see in the parenthetical expression, Camille. When you look at the bottom of this works cited page, you see that his name is listed there as well. There are no page numbers. So the author in the work and the text of their paragraph did not include those page numbers. And we're going to break that down later on in this lecture. But what I want to show you is these connections. If you are listing a name and you're listing a page number within your essay, you have to have that information listed in your works cited. That way your reader has all the information that they need to go locate that particular source. So what are the basics for MLA in-text citations? It's important to remember that every MLA in-text citation is different. Depending on what kind of source you use, you may be required to use different information to indicate that source in your in-text parenthetical expression. For example, if you're citing an academic scholarly article, then the information you include is going to look different than a website that has no author and that's not peer-reviewed. While I'm going to cover the basics today, you need to ensure that you always consider the type of source you're using and realize that each source calls for different types of information. It is your responsibility as a writer and as a scholar to look up the information that's necessary for that particular citation. An in-text citation in MLA aims to give the reader two kinds of information. One, it indicates which source on the works cited page the writer is referring to. And two, it locates where in the source the material is quoted, paraphrased, or summarized and where it can be found, if the source has page numbers or other numbered sections. So let's talk about the basics. The basic MLA in-text citation includes the author's last name, either in the signal phrase, which is within the sentence, introducing the source material, or in parentheses at the end of the sentence. For sources with stable page numbers, it also includes the page number in parentheses at the end of the sentence. This should include most academic peer-reviewed sources that you use. One thing that I want you to note, when you are finding a full text PDF on the Gaston Library site, you need to actually download the entire PDF so that you can see the page numbers as they're mentioned in the actual scholarly journal. If you're only looking at the web, oftentimes they will not give you those page numbers. So here's a sample citation using a signal phrase. And what I mean by signal phrase is this one is actually a direct quote that came from the source material. In his discussion of Monty Python routines, Crystal notes that the group relished breaking the normal rules of language. So what I want you guys to notate is we see that there's an author's name indicated, Crystal, which is the last name of the author. And then we see the page number in the parenthetical expression located at the end of the sentence. One thing that you need to notate is that the period goes after the parenthetical expression. There's no punctuation before the parentheses, only after. A sample parenthetical citation is below. A noted linguist explains that Monty Python humor often relied on bizarre linguistic interactions. In this case, we see that the sentence did not mention the author's name within the sentence itself. Above, we see that that author noted the name Crystal, but below they did not. So what they have to do instead is in those parentheses, in the parenthetical expression at the end, they have to indicate the author's last name as well as the page number. There's no punctuation in between those two. There's no comma. There's no P. There's nothing except for the name and the page number. And then once more, the period goes after the parentheses. So let's talk about the basic format for a quotation. The MLA recommends the author's name in a signal phrase to introduce the material and citing the page numbers. One of the really great ways and reasons why you should use the author's name in a signal phrase is it really creates this seamless transition where you're introducing the work from a scholarly name and perspective. And it's just an easy transition that you don't have to come up with yourself. Lee claims that his comic book creation, Thor, was the first regularly published superhero to speak in a consistently archaic manner. And then we see the page number located there at the end. So once more, we see the author's name at the beginning of that sentence, and we see the page number at the end. And once more, the punctuation goes after that parenthetical expression. When you do not mention the author's name in a signal phrase, you must include it before the page numbers, if any, in the parentheses. Use no punctuation between the author's name and page numbers. The word Bollywood is sometimes considered an insult because it implies that the Indian movies are merely a derivative of the American film industry. And right there we see the author's last name along with the page number. So for a digital or a non-print source, you need to give enough information in a signal phrase or in the parentheses for the reader to locate the source in your list of works cited. Many works found online or electronic databases do not have page numbers, so you can omit the page number in these cases. However, if you're citing a work that has stable page numbers, such as an article in a PDF format, then you do need to include those. So here's an example without the page numbers. As a Slate analyst explains, prominent sports psychologists get praise for their successes and don't get grief for their failures. And then we see the author's name indicated there with no page number. But if it has a page number, then we see that the next sentence, according to Whitmarsh, the British military had experimented using balloons for observation as far back as 1879. The name of the author was in the sentence, and then we see that the page number is at the end, just as the previous. If you have two authors, you need to use both authors' last names in a signal phrase or within the parentheses. Gilbert and Gubar point out that in the Grimm version of Snow White, the king never actually appears in the story at all. Here we see that the authors' names were both indicated within the sentence, and then the page number comes towards the end. And then again, this is just like the last two examples. If you choose to not use those authors within the text that you're writing, you need to make sure you include that information in the parentheses. For three or more authors, you need to use the first author's last name followed by et which means and others, in parentheses or within the sentence. You give the author's name followed by and others in a signal phrase. Similarly, as Belinkie and others assert, examining the lives of women expands our understanding of human development. So what's going to happen there is we use the first author's name within the works cited page, and in this case is Belinkie. And then the and others indicates that there's more than two more authors within that works cited citation. And then again, we see the page number indicated. For an unknown author with a title name, you want to use the full title if it's brief in your text, or a shortened version of the title within the parentheses. One analysis defines hype as an artificially engendered atmosphere of hysteria. Today's 51. So in this case, clearly this was a long title. The author shortened it and then put that with a page number within the parenthetical expression. However, if you would have used the title within the sentence in the text that you actually wrote, you would just simply put the page number at the end. So what happens if you have a really long quote? Well, here's something to consider. First, in a paper of this length, you should not have more than one or two long quotes. But if you're gathering data or you're showing something very important and you need to do something longer than 4 lines, you need to introduce the quote, introduce the block quote in your own words, start with a sentence or two that shows the reader why you're including the quote and how it fits into your argument. After your introductory sentence, you need to add a colon, and then you start the quote on an entirely new line. The next step is that you need to format the quote. Like the rest of your paper, the block quote should be double spaced, indented the entire quote a ½ inch from the left margin, include the same capitalization, punctuation, and line breaks that are in the original text. And then you should cite the quote. At the end of the quote, add a citation directly after the final punctuation mark. This is the one case where your parenthetical expression is going to come after your period. This should contain the name of the author and the page numbers from which the quote was taken. And then finally, you need to comment on the quote. Just as we talked about with building your paragraphs last week, anytime that you are using a block quote or any quote for that matter, you need to make sure that you comment on the quote that you're using. You have to bring the reader to your understanding of why that quote matters. And you should always start and end a paragraph using your own words. And here's a really good example, and I thought a picture would be a great way to explain this. So as you can see, the writer here has a lead in, a transition into the quote. And then the block quote is a ½ inch indent from the rest of the essay. And then here we clearly see that there's a period to end the quote, the author and the page number. And then below that, we can see where the author commented on the quote. Remember, there are only a few of the sources. These are only a few of the source types that you will need to know when you are creating sound and a well-written research essay. Each type of source like a visual aid, a YouTube, or a blog may have different requirements. However, your everyday writer lists many of those, and you can find the rest of them via the internet. And if you have any questions about specific documentation, I'm always happy to help you look for that answer. I really do feel like I learn every single time I teach this class because I have students that use all different types of sources. So if you're using a source that you're really unsure of, just reach out and ask me if you cannot find that answer in your everyday writer. I'm more than happy to help guide you to what information you need to include. All right. And guys, I really look forward to looking through the work that you've already done. If you have any questions as you're starting to draft this essay, please reach out to me. I know that in-text citations, they can be really overwhelming. I'm also going to link this particular PowerPoint to the bottom of the lecture notes so that instead of having to come back to this video, you can move through that for some examples as well. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to reading the work that you've created.